here we had contestants from all 50 states, the territories, and then the Jewish community throughout the US and probably internationally was so enthralled that there never had been a Jewish contestant, let alone to enter, but to win. So it was just, everybody, we didn't have TV, we didn't have internet, but then everybody, every house, Jewish household and a lot of non-Jewish households, everybody's glued to their radio listening. And, there were thousands there in Atlantic City. So you have to put it in perspective how important it was.
Exactly. I was talking about an overall, but yes, and you tell the story in your film, David, where they asked her to change her name to Beth Merrick, I think. And she said, I'm from the Sholem Aleichem, and everybody there is Jewish. And if I don't become Bess Meyerson, they won't know it's me. So she always had a great a loyalty and affinity for her faith.
I think that's true. So after the pageant was finished, Bess did not receive the Ford motor car that was promised and that other pageant winners received. That's not a surprise knowing the history of the Henry Ford Motor Company. And she also did not receive the $5,000 check, the scholarship award, because the sponsors didn't want that scholarship going to a Jewish woman. And yet the scholarship was the reason that that her sister, Helen, was able to convince Bess to take part in the Miss New York City pageant. And then after winning that, into the Miss America pageant. So, and as you know, if you've watched the film, she ran into intense anti-Semitism during the typical victory lap that every Miss America pageant winner had taken following the crown, receiving the crown. But the Anti-Defamation League saved the day after that.
Well, let's back up 2 steps, Cindy. I think it's critical. There was 2 critical turning points for Bess Meyerson. One, she took the high road. As soon as she won, there was a whole conspiracy. There was phone calls and threats to the different judges not to vote for Bess Meyerson. You didn't want a Jew representing Miss America and hence representing the US. And then 2, after all her awards were withdrawn by the corporate sponsors, she was a good player and she commenced the pageant tour. So she made the attempt and for a number of months would go out and tour the country on behalf of the Miss America pageant. And she had to confront hotels, country clubs that all were restricted. A Jew could not show up. People were surprised when she got there. They didn't realize she was Jewish and it was no Jews, no dogs. And she was politely escorted, back out of the venue. So, she threw up her hands finally and notified the pageant that she could not continue the tour. It wasn't anything that she did, but where she was not welcome. And then fortunately, the ADL came to her defense when she returned to the Bronx and said, listen, you're still Miss America. Let's turn this into something positive. And they flipped it and they continued the pageant tour, but under the guise of the ADL. And instead of saying that it was for Miss America, it was talking about her speech, with beauty there is no hate. And she talked about intolerance and anti-Semitism and spoke out to public schools, middle schools, high schools, and realized, at that age, they weren't prejudiced or as prejudiced, and there was an opportunity to show a positive light for a Jewish person.
That's true. Well, from what we know, did Bess Meyerson's relationship with the ADL continue after the tour?
Oh, absolutely. It cemented a permanent relation. So here she is, a 21-year-old girl. She gets zero, zip, nada. She envisioned going to grad school after her year of being Miss America with a $5,000 scholarship that was withdrawn. Instead, Bess Meyerson dedicated her whole life to working on fighting anti-Semitism, intolerance, and fighting for social justice, and always has been a key supporter, both emotionally and financially, with the ADL. and then other social justice causes.
That's true. And as Abe Foxman, the former director of ADL, mentioned in the film, he was a friend of hers, and she would accompany him on fundraising tours for Israel Bonds, for anti-Semitic support. And Abe said that if there was something that Bess Meyerson, there in New York City, a busy career woman working for the city and later active in politics, running for the Senate, if there was something that Bess Meyerson would read in the New York Times or the foreword that disturbed her, she'd just call up Abe Foxman, the director of the whole organization, to say, we need to do something about this. And I also might add of her powerful force in raising funds for Israel. She and Barbara Streisand had a bit of a competition going who could bring in the most money for Israel Bonds. And when she would go to Israel, and she went frequently, loved the country with a passion, she and her daughter, Bara, would meet with Golda Meir and other leaders. So she was very much committed and loyal to the ADL in subsequent years. Well, just for the last couple questions before we move on to some audience questions, what do you see as your most important takeaway from the documentary, from the story of Bess Meyerson? I'll ask David first, and then Vicki. Most important message.
As a filmmaker, I think Bess Meyerson is a great role model and tremendous inspiration. Here she was an ordinary person, didn't get into the Miss America contest necessarily to win, but she thought she'd get some scholarship money. But when she had to come against that brick wall, once having all the prizes taken away, and two, experiencing anti-Semitism in the trenches on her tour in America, rather than say, woe is me, she rebooted, and here's this ordinary girl who went on to do extraordinary things.
Vicki, how about you? What's the most important takeaway from the story of Bess Meyerson?
Well, I think it has to resonate with what David said. She didn't give up. She made something of herself. She used her talent, her beauty, and especially her brains to go further and to keep building a career and to inspire. She always was a focus of inspiration for women. And speaking of that, there's something that you may or know or not know. Before Bess ran in the Miss America pageant, before Lenore Slaughter got really involved, it was all male judges, and they were all usually illustrators like Russell Patterson or Harry Conover, who owned a modeling agency. But then Lenore brought in women judges, and that also altered who would win, because it wasn't just about legs and figures. In those days, believe it or not, they would actually measure your body on stage. Can you imagine the humiliation? But it changed with Lenore. That was one of the good things she did. And Bess was emblematic of not only women and the women empowering women, but also it was so symbolic. I remember as a little girl, I actually sold war bonds on the boardwalk in a WAC uniform with wax. And that's the same time as I was Bess's page. So I was very, very aware of the war and of the soldiers who were injured. And when Bess went to visit those soldiers, some of the mothers would look at her and say, you made my son like this. You caused my son these injuries. We fought that war to free your people. And that really hurt, really hurt.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Part of the anti-Semitism that just unfortunately still continues. I know Sacramento's gone through such hate crime evidence as, swastikas in Jewish cemeteries. So the social justice issues are still with us. So Fred, do you want to field some questions from our viewers?
Well, I understand that Tevin would like to do something before I start with a question.
Yes, thank you, Fred. So I apologize for this, but my cute little Zoom didn't start automatically recording this session. And one of our audience members pointed out that cute little red button wasn't working. So So what I'd like to do is just do quick introductions again before we go to the audience. So my name is Tevin Laxter. I'm the director of the Sacramento Jewish Film Festival. We are a program of the Jewish Federation of the Sacramento region and the JCRC, which is the Jewish Community Relations Council. I'd also like to point out that all these chats are being recorded. They're available on our YouTube channel and on the special events pages of our website. Tomorrow night is our closing night ceremony, 7 p.m. We will be providing links if you haven't seen them yet. We can email those out later. And this has been a wonderful ride. I hope that you've all been enjoying our film festival. Cindy Graff Cohen has been moderating the discussion so far. I really apologize that the first few moments wasn't recorded. Cindy has been a writer and editor for the past 40 years, including she was the editor of the Jewish Voice in El Paso, Texas, part of the Jewish Federation. And I'd like to ask Cindy to again introduce the panel members that you've been hearing for the last 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll go to our audience. So Cindy, if you could please come back.
Sure, of course. David Arond is the filmmaker, the director and producer of the one and only Jewish Miss America. Started his career as a sound effects editor in Hollywood and then moved on to producing PBS documentaries, including the MacArthur Foundation award-winning documentary, Mother of the Year. He's worked in international broadcast journalism in Europe, Central Asia, Australia, and Latin America, including 3 years in Moscow as the bureau chief and reporter for the PBS Nightly Business Report and Worldwide News in London. The grandson of Jewish immigrants who escaped pogroms in Russia, David was drawn to the story of Bess Meyerson, whose parents were Russian immigrants. Vicki Gold Levi was a longtime friend of Bess Meyerson, going back to when Vicki, at age 6, 75 years ago, served as her page, her assistant, when Bess returned to the pageant in 1946 to pass on her crown. Born and raised in Atlantic City, Vicki has shared her hometown's history through books, film, television appearances, and museum exhibits. Her father was Al Gold, the city's first official photographer, and we're thrilled that some of his photographs are featured in this documentary. Author of 5 books and a collector of historic photographs and artifacts, Vicki co-founded the Atlantic City Historical Museum, and she's consulted on the PBS documentary There She Is, Miss America, Disney World's Boardwalk Resort in Orlando, and I'm sure you remember HBO's Boardwalk Empire series. She's a go-to source for information about the pageant, and she served as a pageant judge herself.
Thank you.
Thanks. And in case those photos didn't appear earlier, could you show those photos again, please?
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
This is just a fun picture of Vicki. And she is carrying Bess Meyerson's trail. Do you see her with a hat? So that's our speaker, Vicki, here today. And then also this is a picture of Bess Meyerson in front of the scholarship blank check or certificate. Of course, a scholarship for $5,000 that she never received. And then lastly, I think it's important to show that Bess Meyerson was the only college graduate out of all the contestants, fresh from Hunter College, majoring in music. And you see the other women, some of the potential winners, they're in swimsuits and something that a very different image. And I might just add that Bess Meyerson's own mother, she was not crazy about her daughter being shown in public in a swimsuit. But Bess wanted that scholarship. So we'll move on with those questions.
All right. So if we're ready, I'm on the film selection committee, and one of our criteria that we hope for is that people will learn something from the films. And certainly this is a film that has a lot. For baby boomers in the pantheon of Jewish American women, there was Golda Meir and there was Bess Meyerson. One factor in Bess's life we learn is growing up in the Shalom Aleichem apartments. Could someone address that issue? What kind of environment was it? Was it a nurturing environment? Was it exclusively for recent arrivals? Or all the people who live there on limited incomes? David?
I can cover that. What's so fascinating about the Shalom Aleichem Housing Cooperative, it was part of the progressive element of Jewish society, largely new immigrants, largely from Eastern Europe and Russia. Most of them were committed to progressive politics, social change. The predominant language was Yiddish, and universally everybody was poor. It was up from the bootstraps. Bess Meyerson's father was a house painter. Other people worked in the trades. There were a lot of union organizers with the ladies garment workers. So a very progressive environment. A lot of push on education. A lot of the kids took advantage of Hunter College and the great educational opportunities in New York City. And there was also a lot of writers and push on the arts and culture. So other than being poor, it was a nourishing environment.
Thank you. Do any of you have more insights to share on the relationship between Bess and her mother? It's a major factor in the film. And I'm just wondering if she ever spoke to you, Vicki, for example, about her mother. Did you ever meet her mother?
No, I never met her mother. I met her sister at the pageant, the one who, there's a story about how the bathing suit they originally gave Bess was too small, and they wanted her to wear this ugly green suit that was too big, but her sister slept in the bathing suit because she was bigger than Bess so that it would stretch. So she was a little sister. Bess's mother was kind of strict. She didn't speak English. She wasn't that solicitous of Bess doing this, but in the end, she was proud. Her father was the more sweet and gentle type, but she never really spoke much to me about her mother.
Thank you. David?
And those were challenging, difficult times. The father tried to support his family, even there in the housing cooperative. If you didn't pay your rent, people were evicted. It was a hard life. It was a one-bedroom apartment. The 3 kids slept in the 1 bedroom, and then the parents slept outside in the living room on the couch, and they did the best they could. And I think that was sort of the norm. It was her mother, Bess Meyerson's mother, was illiterate. She was an immigrant. She only spoke Yiddish. She had to decode coming to America and try to do the best she can. And then also in the throes, she lost her son, and I think was totally, devastated by that. It might have been PTSD, who knows, but she never was normal after the passing of her son. He died from one of the childhood illnesses back then that were fairly common.
Thank you very much. You all will note that in the film, Bess Meyerson is the representative of New York City. Vicki, is that still continue where they have city representation?
No. Back in those days, you had Miss Pittsburgh, Miss Philadelphia, Miss Chicago. That was very common. And I don't know what year they eliminated that, but now it's just states. But that
Thank you.
In the beginning, 1921, there was only 8 contestants, and we were all from cities.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout her life, Bess demonstrated an inner reserve of confidence, and she was able to project that confidence to those she met. Where do you think that came from?
Jewish chutzpah.
Cindy?
I can remember visiting Bess every time she came to Atlantic City. Remember, she was a pageant co-host for about 10 years, if I'm not mistaken.
Mhm.
Whenever she would come to Atlantic City, my mother would put a dress on me and she would take me up to Convention Hall to see Bess. And Bess had to develop a tough skin. There was a lot of misogyny back then. Even though I was little, I could feel it. I could just feel it in the room, you know? And I think she had to get tough to make her career work and to, you know, to deal with the men in her career path and such and such. So I think her resolve came from her own ambition and drive.
Thank you. How about fame? She was famous for most of her life. And famous, we know, is a double-edged sword. How did that affect her in her dealings with others, her relationships, her family?
Well, I can remember Bara, her daughter, talking about how it affected her. And even when she was in elementary school and her mother would be taking her, walking her to school, she'd hear people on the sidewalk, you know, around them saying, oh, look, that's Bess Meyerson, and look, and that was the first time that Bara was aware that her mom was someone else to so many people. I had heard from others that that Bess really stayed humble in many ways. Of course, she had to have that inner reserve of confidence that you're referring to. And I can't help but wonder, if there were so few women in the 40s with college degrees, if maybe that college education helped her maintain her poise.
Also, she was a big TV personality, the big payoff, to tell the truth, all of those things. You had to have a real personality to get on those shows with Dorothy Kilgallen and Bennett Cerf and those wits of the day. So I think she developed these things as an evolution along the way.
Absolutely. And those of us that remember those TV shows remember her quite vividly.
And then it was interesting.
One of our
I wanted
go
to
ahead.
add one thing too. That was very interesting with Bess Meyerson. You know, that was her day job, being the TV personality. She was, you know, smart as a whip and beautiful and talented. But what she really aspired to was making it a better world. So she segued over from TV into politics. So she became the first consumer affairs director for the city of New York City, the cultural affairs director. She attempted a run for Senate for New York State. She was best friends with Ed Koch. So she saw herself, plus always being involved with the ADL. So she saw herself as a player. You know, there was no holes barred for Bess Meyerson. She was self-made, but she became the symbol of the Jewish people and especially Jewish women.
And speaking of that, today for Jewish women, what does the Miss America pageant represent? Any thoughts on that, Vicki?
Well, I'll tell you a little secret. I think I've told David and Cindy this before. There actually is another Jewish Miss America.
I remember.
She was not Jewish when she ran. In fact, she's biracial, and she replaced Vanessa Williams. But today she is a modern Orthodox Jew. She's a very dear friend of mine, Suzette Charles, and she takes her faith very seriously. But Jewish girls, as Barra said, they didn't usually aspire to go into Miss America. It wasn't something that they it wasn't in their DNA. So I don't even know how many girls ever ran for Miss America that were Jewish. And we don't have another Jewish Miss America who was crowned Miss America. We might have had some contestants. I don't have the data on that. But nobody was crowned as Miss America besides Bess.
And along with what Vicki said, not only was it not Jewish, but it was an embarrassment to Bess Meyerson's mother that her daughter was going to be publicly displayed in a bathing suit. So they elected not to have the mother participate. She stayed home, and then it was Bess Meyerson's sister who attended, which was the exception to the rule.
I want to add something. It was actually in the bylaws of the Miss America pageant that no Negro girl could be Miss America until a much later date when they started to have African-American contestants. And I don't know the year that was lifted. That's something I want to find out because I've been asked that many times, but it was actually in the bylaws.
Wow.
Thank you. In the development of American feminism, where would we place Miss America, Bess Myerson? Cindy, you have some thoughts?
Not in that timeline. It's hard to say. I mean, this year we're celebrating 100 years of the Miss America pageant, and it did start off being strictly a swimsuit bathing beauty contest. And it was with the new director, Lenora Slaughter, as you know from the film, who began to make a difference and focus on something besides long legs and perfect figures. So I would have to say it would be a very early point on that timeline of a more liberated and respected woman. I think that Bess Myerson herself was a feminist. I mean, to run for Senate and to lead a large municipal agency such as she did, I think she was ahead of her time.
Absolutely.
Ironically, when she was director of consumer affairs for New York City, despite all the trouble she had even securing the position of Miss America, the large food corporations, General Mills, things like that, she went truth in labeling and really took on the major food providers. And that's when she really was a trendsetter on establishing all the consumer protection acts that we take for granted these days. It came out of Bess Myerson's office, Consumer Affairs, New York City. But in those days, they would try to discredit her by showing the picture of her in her bathing suit at the pageant and say, what does a beauty queen know about consumer affairs, even though she was college educated? So it's sort of a double-edged sword. So, not that she aspired to be a beauty queen, but they did a terrible negative publicity campaign that sort of backfired. We didn't have enough time to include that in the film, but I thought it was incredulous that here, she had such a hard time becoming Miss America, and then they hold that against her. But,
right.
Yeah.
In 1979, I think, is when they introduced the platform in the pageant. And that made a big difference, too. That gave it more dignity and more relevance, because before that, they had the scholarship, but then it was all about, beauty and legs and talent and stuff. But in 1979, every girl who ran, even all the way back to the city levels, had to have a platform that she worked on all year while she was in the running. So that was another important element.
Yeah. Well, going back to feminism just a bit, when we think of Bella Abzug, Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, would we add Bess Myerson?
Yes,
absolutely.
Definitely.
It's in the Jewish DNA.
Yeah. Atlantic City was the site, the Miss America pageant was the site of one of the early major feminist rallies. Remember the Burn Your Bra rally in Atlantic City? Yeah. At the same time Miss America was going on. They didn't actually burn their bras, but they threw them into a big garbage can. They didn't get a fire permit to burn them. So that was one of the real beginnings of the feminist movement, this Atlantic City anti-Miss America protest. In the 70s. I can't remember the date, but it was in the 70s.
As Bara Grant has pointed out about her mother, that the expectations at Sholem Aleichem and certainly in the pageant were a beautiful girl could go and marry a doctor or a lawyer or some, obviously had to be Jewish, some more wealthy husband. And that was the expectations. Of course, Bess went far beyond that. But Vara said that when she got advice from her mother, of course, flipped it and told Vara, you can be a doctor, you can be a lawyer. She sent her to Swarthmore College for an excellent education. She sent her, at Vara's wishes, to a fine theatrical school in London so she could pursue her acting career. And so Vara took the lessons that her mother had shared with her, that your brain was the most important part of you.
And Vara had many accomplishments of her own. She wrote plays and movies and she acted in them. she made a lot of accomplishments on her very own.
And Bara is the only child of Bess Myerson from, was it a brief marriage?
Well,
Brief.
she had, her father was not Grant, her stepfather was Grant, and he adopted Bara. And I think both of those marriages were fairly brief. And Bara has a daughter. I remember Bess was very attached to her daughter.
The first marriage was shortly after the pageant to a man who had returned from the war, very handsome man, and that was Bara's father. But his struggle with alcoholism was exacerbated by the tremendous success of his wife, and it proved to be a short-lived marriage.
Yeah. And then she married Arnold Grant, and that's where Bara gets the grant.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Who was taller than Bess, which was an achievement.
And unfortunately, Bess's later years have overclouded some of our memories of her successes and her glory from the pageant on. How would we remember her now? How should we remember her now as a figure in American Jewish history? David?
I think she's a legacy. She's an inspiration, and unfortunately, her popular, older people, my mother, who's 91, remembers her, but that generation is dying off. But I think we need to rekindle, and that's why I did the film, that here's probably one of the most important people in American Jewish history and made a real difference for our, combating anti-Semitism and also advancing the cause of Israel.
Definitely. Cindy?
I would agree. She was a woman ahead of her time with a lot of compassion, not just for the cause of Jewish Americans, but for instance, while she was head of consumer affairs, she had some of the manuals and policies and instructions translated to Spanish, unheard of in the 1960s. So she stood up for, and she had partnerships with the NAACP. She stood up for all minorities and underserved populations.
Thank you. And finally, from the person who actually knew Bess Myerson, how would you like us to remember her, Vicki?
Well, as a beacon of light for Judaism, for women, for Jewish women, a symbol of the ending of the war. She gave so much hope and inspiration to this country. Bess was formidable, make no mistake about that. But she also served such a deep purpose on so many levels. There used to be saying about Bess, if she loved you, she'd kill for you. If she didn't, she'd kill you. And I fortunately was in the first group, but I found her always to be down to earth and warm. She never forgot my birthday or the Jewish holiday. She was very, very involved with Judaism, especially towards the later years too. And I think when people think of Bess, they have to think of her with pride. She belongs in that pantheon of Bella Abzug and others like her, Gloria Steinem. She really does.
Yeah,
Thank
these
you
were
so
ordinary
much.
women who went on to do extraordinary things.
Thank you all for sharing your talents with us today. Devin, I'm going to turn it back over to you for the conclusion. Go ahead.
Oh, I was muted. Okay. Thank you very much, Fred. Thanks to all of you for joining us today for this live chat. I appreciate all the panel members for taking time to join us. It's been very wonderful, captivating. I learned a lot from the film as well. And again, we still have several more days of films. We have films through March 26. Check our website for the schedule. And please join us tomorrow night for a closing ceremony. We're closing actually, a couple of days earlier than some films are available longer because they're 72-hour periods. So it's kind of funny to have a closing night on Wednesday night when the festival really has films through Friday. But thank you all very much. And I appreciate you all being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.